Hello and welcome to today's edition of the Daf Yomi Menachot Menachot, and we're in Daf 70b. Just to finish off, just repeat the Mishnah and Gemara so we don't go in the start in the middle of a thread. Wheat, barley, spelt, oats, rye. These are obligated and separated of Challah, and each one of them joined together with the others to constitute the measure that obligates one to separate Challah. They are prohibited due to the prohibition of partaking of the new crop prior to the Passover festival, and likewise it is prohibited to reap them prior to the Omer offering. If these grains took root prior to the Omer offering, the Omer permits their consumption, and if not, they are prohibited until the next Omer is brought and sacrificed following in the Gemara. The Gemara discusses the identity of the species mentioned in the Mishnah. A sage taught in a Braita, spelt is a type of wheat, while oats and rye are a type of barley. The Gemara translates the lesser-known species into the vernacular Aramaic. Spelt is called gulva, rye is dishra, and oats are shibolet ta'ala. The Gemara infers, with regard to these species, yes, the obligation of Challah applies to them, but concerning rice and millet, no, the obligation of Challah does not apply to them. So let's explain what rice and millet is. Oles is rice. Ortus savia is the Latin name, is an annual plant from the grain family. It can grow as high as 1 meter and is cultivated mostly in swamps or irrigated summer ponds. When inside its shell, a rice grain is ordinarily yellow, although some strains are red. Rice originated in the Far East, but by the Mishnaic period, it had been imported to Eretz Yisrael and was cultivated there as well. Rice was used primarily in porridge, as its lack of gluten renders it virtually impossible to be formed into bread. Numerous attempts have been made to develop strands of rice from which bread can be prepared. Apparently, although rice does rise somewhat, it does not become leavened like wheat or barley. Like millet, rice is classified as a grain by botanical definitions, but is not a bread grain, in contrast of the species of grain mentioned in the Mishnah. And let's explain millet. Dochan. The identification of Dochan is discussed by the commentators and researchers. The most commonly accepted opinion identifies it as the grain Panacum miliaceum. This plant grows to a height of 1 to 1.5 meters, and its flowers are contained with long panicles. Its small seeds, 2 to 3 millimeters in diameter, are yellow or gold. Nowadays, this grain is mainly used as animal fodder or as porridge. Although flour is prepared from this grain cannot be used to form bread, it is sometimes added to bread made from other types of grain. And there's pictures here of a rice plant and millet stalks. The Gemara asks, from where is this matter that only the 5 grains are obligated to separate from Challah derived? Reish Lakish said, this principle is derived by means of a verbal analogy between bread and bread from the case of Matzah. It is written here with regard to Challah, and it shall be that when you eat of the bread of the land, you shall set apart a portion for the gift to the Lord. In Numbers 15:19, it is written there with regard to Matzah, bread of affliction, Deuteronomy 16:3. Just as Matzah can be prepared only for one of those 5 grains, so too the obligation of Challah applies only to bread from one of those 5 grains. The Gemara asks, and there with regard to Matzah itself, from where do we derive that it must be from one of those 5 grains? The Gemara answers, Reish Lakish said, and likewise the sage of the school of Rabbi Shmuel taught, and likewise the sage of the school of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov taught, that the verse states, you shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days shall you eat it with matzah, the bread of affliction. In Deuteronomy 16:3, this verse indicates that only with regard to substances that will come to a state of leavening does the person fulfill his obligation to eat matzah by eating them on Passover, provided that he prevents them from becoming leavened. This serves to exclude these foods, i.e. rice, millet, and similar grains, with which even if flour is prepared from them and water is added to their flour, do not come to a state of leavening, but to a state of decay, a Sirchon. So what does that mean? We explained it before? No, Sirchon means decay. Some commentators explain that this term refers to a foul smell that comes from a spoiled substance. Accordingly, the Gemara is referring to rice and millet that came into contact with water, turn moldy, and emitted a foul smell. Others relate the term Sirchon in this context to the phrase, the overlapping excess, Sirah Ha'odef, Exodus 26:12, that is, the bread will not rise, but there will be some excess matter due to the fermentation. Rabbi Yehuda ben Rav Binyam Harofa. Likewise, rice and millet do not rise, but expand beyond their normal size when they come into contact with water. The Mishnah teaches that each one of the five types of grain joined together with the others to constitute the measure that obligates one to separate challah. It was taught in a brayta with regard to grain for produce and flours and pieces of dough. Each one of these joined together with the others. The Gemara asks with regard to what halacha was this taught. Rav Kahana says it was taught with regard to prohibition of eating of the new crop prior to the sacrifice of the Omer on the 16th of Nisan. Le'inyan chadash, with regard to a new crop, the later commentaries explain that had it not been for the ruling of the brayta, one might have thought that grain, flour, and dough are considered distinct entities with regard to the new crop, as each one is referred to separately in the verse. And you shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh ears until the sale same day. This is 23:14. The term bread includes dough, parched grain can refer to flour, and fresh ears is raw grain. For this reason, the Bible teaches that these substances combine, and that's from the Chidushi Batra. If one ate grain, flour, and dough of the new crop that combined to equal the size of an olive bulb, he is liable to receive lashes for transgressing a prohibition. Rav Yosef says it was taught with regard to the prohibition of eating leavened bread on Passover. Rav Papa says it was taught with regard to the prohibition of eating second tithe outside the walls of Jerusalem. What's second tithe? Master Sheni. Second tithe is 1/10 of the produce that remained after the two had been given to the priest, and the first tithe was given to the Levites. Second tithe was separated during the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the sabbatical cycle. After the second tithe was set aside, it was brought to Jerusalem to be consumed there by its owner. If the journey to Jerusalem was too long, so that it would be difficult to transport all of the second tithe there, or if the produce became richly impure, it could be redeemed for an equivalent sum of money. If the owner redeemed his own produce, he was required to add 1/5 of its value. This redemption money was brought to Jerusalem, where it could be spent only on food. As if one ate a combined olive bulb's worth of grain, flour, and dough of the second tithe outside the wall of Jerusalem, he is flogged. Rava says the brayta is referring to the matter of its impurity of food. Kernels of wheat, flour, and dough combine together to form the measure of an egg bulk, the minimum measure for food to conduct rich impurity. This is a halacha only if they are somewhat attached, even if the bond between them is loose enough that when one lifts one, it becomes detached from the other. The halacha is in accordance with Rava's explanation of the brayta. I'm going to say if the Ha'ay 4:3 and see the Mishnah Lamanach there. And this is what it teaches us, that grains of barley, produce, and flours are similar to pieces of dough. Just as there, concerning pieces of dough, they combine to form the minimal measure of richly impure food only if the combination of food is as is, without any additives. So to here also, concerning grain and flour, they combine to form the minimal measure of richly impure food, only when the mixture is food as is, without any shell or other additives. The Gemara cites support for this opinion. As is taught in the brayta, wheat, whether shelled or unshelled, combines to form the minimal measure of food that is susceptible to its impurity, but as for barley, it combines only when it is shelled. When it is not shelled, it does not combine together, as the inedible shell interposes between the different grains. This supports Rava's interpretation of the brayta that it addresses barley in the form of grain, flour, and dough. The Gemara asks, is that so, that the shell of barley is not considered part of the grain with regard to combining for its impurity? But didn't the school of Rabbi Yishmael teach in a brayta, before a food item comes in contact with liquid, it is not susceptible to its impurity? As the verse states, if anything falls from the carcasses upon any sowing seed that is sown, it is pure. But if water be put upon the seed, or if any of the carcass falls thereon, it is impure unto you. Leviticus 11:37-38. The brayta teaches that the term that is sown teaches that the entire seed is susceptible to rich impurity when it is in a state where it is typical for people to take it out of the field for sowing. What's the footnote? Kederech mibnei Adam, in a state where it is typical for people. The protective layer of produce combines with the produce to constitute the minimal measure of food that is set to rich impurity. This is derived from the verse, upon any sowing seed that is sown, which the sages interpret to mean that produce becomes susceptible to its impurity in the usual state in which it is planted. This includes wheat, barley, and lentil kernels while still in their shells, as well as protective layers and shells of other produce. Rambam Sefer Tahara, Hilchot Tumat Ochanin 5:4. This applies to wheat in its shell, barley in its shell, and lentils in the shells. Adashim, lentils. Lenticularis, are a type of legume. It grows in pods on a bushy plant that is 40 centimeters tall with purple flowers. It's planted at the beginning of the winter and harvested after Passover or Nishavuot. There is evidence that lentils have been consumed by humans since antiquity throughout the world. They were used to prepare soups and were also mixed with honey to form cakes. And it's demonstrated that shells are considered part of the grain with regard to ritual impurity. The Gemara answers, this is not difficult. The ruling of this Bible, which teaches that the shells of kernels are considered part of it with regard to its impurity, is stated with regard to moist kernels, whereas the ruling of that Bible, which teaches that the shells are not part of the seed, is stated with regard to dry kernels. Let's explain it. Rashi suggests two explanations of the Gemara's distinction between moist and dry kernels. The first is that although the shells of barley seeds are themselves inedible, they combine to form the minimal measure of food that contracts with impurity because they provide protection for the edible moist kernel. The second interpretation is that the shells themselves are edible, but only when the kernel is moist. Rashi himself questions the explanation because even if the dry shells are inedible, they should combine with the kernels as long as they provide protection for the kernels. The Rambam maintains the opposite. He states that the shells of dry kernels combine with the kernels inside, whereas the shells of moist seeds do not. The commentaries explain that the Rambam's ruling is based upon the statement of the school of Rabbi Shmuel that a seed contacts with impurity in the manner in which it is sowed. Therefore, only the shells of dry kernels combine with the kernels, as people generally plant dry kernels, not moist ones. And that's in the case of Mishnah, in which the shells crumble and fall away. The Mishnah teaches with regard to the 5 grains, and they are forbidden due to the prohibition of partaking of the new crop prior to the Passover festival. Then we'll ask, from where is this matter derived? Mahane Mile, from where is this matter derived? According to Rashi, this question and this answer are similar to those with regard to the source for the exclusion of rice and millet from the obligation to separate challah. From where is it derived that rice and millet are excluded from the prohibition against partaking of the new crop? Because of a question this interpretation, since in that case the focus is on rice and millet, and consequently the Gemara should have prefaced its inquiry by inferring from the Mishnah that only the 5 grains are subject to prohibition of the new crop, and not rice and millet. Tosfot therefore states that the Gemara wants to prove the 5 grains are subject to the prohibition of the new crop, as one might have thought that only barley is prohibited, as it is the grain from which the Omer offering is brought. See Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah and Shita Mechubesed. Reish Lakish said, it is derived by means of a verbal analogy between bread written in connection with the prohibition of the new crop, see Leviticus 23:14, and bread written with regard to matzah, see Deuteronomy 16:3. Just as matzah can be prepared only for one of the 5 grains, so too the prohibition against eating of the new crop applies only to the 5 grains. The Mishnah further teaches with regard to the 5 grains, and is prohibited to reap them prior to the offering. The Gemara asks, from where these matters derived? Rabbi Yochanan said, it is derived by means of a verbal analogy between the first, written in conjunction with the new crop. You shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, Leviticus 23:10, and the first written with regard to Challah, of the first of your dough, you shall set apart a cake for a gift, Numbers 15:20. Just as the obligation to separate Challah applies only to bread prepared from 5 grains, so too the prohibition against rearing the new crop prior to the offering applies only to the crops of 5 grains. The Gemara asks, what does the Mishnah mean when it says prior to the Omer? Does it mean prior to the reaping of the Omer grain, or prior to the sacrifice of the Omer offering? Rabbi Yonah, who's that? Rabbi Yonah was one of the most prominent 4th generation Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael, and is often mentioned in conjunction with his contemporary Rabbi Yossi. In his youth, he apparently studied under Rabbi Yochanan, although his main teachers were Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yirmiyah. The Babylonian Talmud describes Rabbi Yonah as one of the forceful scholars of Eretz Yisrael, by both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jewish Talmud relate their stories of his modesty and righteousness, as well as the miracles brought about through his prayers. He cited often in the Jewish Talmud, and many of the scholars of the 16th generation were students, including his son Rabbi Mana, who was himself a leading sage. In the contrast to his notable presence in the Jerusalem Talmud, Rabbi Yonah is mentioned only occasionally in the Babylonian Talmud. It says, it means prior to the reaping of the Omer grain, the new crop is permitted at daybreak on the 16th of Nisan. Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda says, prior to the bringing of the Omer offering later that day. Who's that? Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda was a 4th generation Amor from Eretz Yisrael, often referred to in the Jewish Talmud as simply Rabbi Yossi. He was a close colleague of Rabbi Yonah. The two lived in the city of Tiberias and were partners in both spiritual and worldly matters. In addition to leading the community together during a time of great persecution, they also shared ownership of a winery. After Rabbi Yonah's passing, the people turned to Rabbi Yossi for halachic rulings. His scholarship was respected as far away as Alexandria in Egypt, from where he received regular correspondence. In addition to halachic decisions Rabbi Yossi provided for the residents of Alexandria, he also helped determine their festival calendar. The Gemara cites a proof from that which we learned in the Mishnah. And they are forbidden due to the prohibition of partaking of the new crop prior to the Passover festival, and likewise it is prohibited to reap them prior to the sacrifice of the Omer offering. Granted, according to the one who said that the prohibition applies prior to the bringing of the Omer offering, this is the reason that the Mishnah did not combine the clauses together and teach them as one, since the time frame for each prohibition is different. The prohibition of harvesting the new crop is lifted at daybreak after the Omer crop was harvested at night, whereas the prohibition against consuming the new crop ends only with the sacrifice of this Omer offering later that day. But according to the one who said that the prohibition applies prior to the reaping of the Omer grain, then both the consuming and the harvesting of the new crop are permitted at daybreak of the 16th of Nisan. If so, let the Mishnah combine them and teach them together as follows. And they are forbidden due to the prohibition of partaking of the new crop, and likewise it is prohibited to reap them prior to the Passover festival. The Gemara answers, if a dispute was stated in this matter, it was stated with regard to the latter clause of the Mishnah, which teaches if these grains took root prior to the Omer offering, the Omer permits their consumption. What does the Mishnah mean when it says prior to the Omer? Rabbi Yonah says prior to the bringing of the Omer sacrifice. Rabbi Yossi ben Zavta says prior to the harvesting of the Omer grain. Rabbi Elazar said too. That's the end of the Omer. Thank you for listening, and wish you all the best. Bye.